afternoon. That's exactly what we ended up doing. Hi, I'm Patty Mabry, the Executive Director of the Network Science Institute. Yes, we do have a visitor up there flying around. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a few previews of things to come. So 5 of them, to be exact. One is we have the Multi-Omics Interest Group meeting. It'll be 3 to 5 p.m. on December the 15th. This is where we're currently talking about using Alzheimer's disease in a hopefully NIH grant application to test out some ideas of how to link different layers of biology. If you're interested and you have not received that invitation, please let us know. So it's at Goodman Hall in Indianapolis, 3 to 5 p.m. December 15th. The next one is the Open Science Forum. So this is the Observatory on Social Media. We'll be presenting Giovanni Ciampaglia, one of our research scientists. We'll be presenting at the SSRC, Woodburn Hall 200 at 4 p.m. I didn't put the date, but I think it was January 17th. And this is to talk about an enhanced portal for IU to access Twitter data, including the decahose, including billions of tweets. Yes, billions. We also have our IUNI Research Scientist Showcase. This will be on January 22nd, SSRC at 3 p.m., and followed by a reception at 4 p.m. We have 6 research scientists faculty at IUNI. They are Erin Pullen, Giovanni Ciampaglia, Shaoran Yan, Alice Patania, Kate Edens, and Hank Green. And they have, just like the rest of IUNI, they're multifaceted, multidisciplinary. You will see there's something for everyone at this show. So please join us on January 22nd, 3 p.m. SSRC for that. We also have 2 more network science talks to tell you about in the spring, so mark your calendars. March 26th, 3 p.m. is Rika Albert from Penn State, and April 9th at 3 p.m. Luis Amaral from Northwestern, and I think location is TBD. Yeah, here in Union somewhere. We aren't sure exact room. So anyway, welcome everyone. We look forward to an exciting talk from our speaker, Anna Mueller, and I'll go ahead and let Anne McGraney from IUNI introduce our speaker today.
Yep. Thanks. Hi, so I'm not going to spend too long introducing her because I really want her to be able to talk about her research. I think it's fascinating, and I think you'll find it fascinating too. Anna is with the Department of Comparative Human Development. I had to write it down so I'd make sure I get it straight. But she's also a sociologist. She got her PhD at UT Austin, had made her way through the Population Research Center there, and is also now an associate with the Population Research Center at the University of Chicago. Her research, she actually has a number of different projects, but the big theme in her research is suicide, of course, as she's going to talk about today. And she focuses on looking at suicide in adolescence and young adulthood. So with no further ado, I will let you get started. Thanks a lot for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've had a really great day getting to see the campus and meet some of the faculty, some of whom I've had so many interactions with, like over email and through various sections of ASA. So it's really great to actually be here in person. So I'm going to just delve right into my presentation after briefly acknowledging some of my collaborators on these projects. So Dr. Seth Alberton, who's at the University of British Columbia, has collected the data and done the analysis and the writing of the manuscripts with me. And then since coming to Chicago, we've had the good luck to work with 2 really fabulous research assistants. Melissa Osborne is kind of the primary assistant on the work that I'm presenting today, and she's a co-author. And then Sonia Micklin, I'll sort of briefly mention some work that Sonia and Seth and I are doing that's related to the main part of the talk today. So what I'd like to do today is probably a little bit different than what you're used to in a network science talk, because I'm going to be introducing some qualitative data that has network elements to it. And what I'd like to do is use this data to elaborate our understanding of how social influence happens during diffusion processes. And to do that, I want to leverage the sort of unique case of adolescent suicide, and specifically to illustrate the utility of incorporating insights from cultural sociology into network theories to sort of better our understanding of diffusion. So if we think about like the basic diffusion process, diffusion first involves contact or exposure to some behavior or idea, et cetera. And this exposure can be direct or indirect. And then, of course, comes the really important part of social influence. And we think of influence as occurring through persuasion or coercion, but then also through emulation and imitation. And I think that actually, in general, science does a worse job sort of understanding what we really mean when we say emulation and imitation. We do a little bit of a better job understanding what is really happening when someone's persuading someone to uptake like technology or an idea. And so that's where some of my work comes in. Now, anytime when we're talking about social diffusion, we have to be really careful to also consider competing explanations. And really, in the case of diffusion, it's very important to think about how social selection into those very relationships that we're theorizing are influential, are changing us, how that also might sort of, be sort of complicating the picture of what we're observing. So actually my early research on suicide diffusion was very focused on this part of the question and understanding using like longitudinal data sets and some social networks and some without social networks data to understand whether or not suicide actually is capable of diffusing through social ties. So I'm only gonna like sort of briefly talk about that today. I'm just gonna sort of nod to that area of my research, but I'm happy to talk about it in more depth. But briefly, it does seem like suicidal thoughts and attempts, and in some studies, deaths are capable of actually diffusing through social ties, and that it's not just due to social selection into those very relationships. So a lot of the research on diffusion processes more generally often has focused on sort of the structural underpinnings of diffusion. So in other words, what forms of network structures or what structural locations of actors within a network are most sort of efficacious at facilitating diffusion. And this is absolutely important work. It's helped us understand that social cohesion is obviously very important to diffusion. Dense ties amplify the likelihood that someone's going to be exposed to a given behavior or idea, and that obviously matters. We've also got a large literature on weak ties, and that has shown that particularly in exposure to new ideas or new behaviors, our weak ties can be more important than our strong ties. And when I say weak ties in this context, I'm talking about the friends of our friends, the colleagues of our colleagues. I mean, this is, again, is quite logical. The people that we know and interact with or who share our primary group memberships often have the same information or cultural values or so on and so forth as we do. So those weak relationships are often really important for the diffusion of new of new ideas. And then finally, there's research on individuals who bridge structural holes within a network. They can have a lot of sort of power in sort of determining what type of information gets diffused through the network if they serve as that uniform bridge. And then, of course, we have research that shows that high social status role models and role models that we perceive as similar to ourselves can be highly influential in terms of our desire to uptake their behavior or ideas. If we think about social influence, a lot of the idea behind why social influence can happen through social networks is basically this idea that conformity to perceived norms or other beliefs or behaviors, it satisfies essentially our social psychological needs to fit into our primary social groups or to avoid the sanctions from standing out. This is sort of the human motivation. This drive for conformity can be particularly important in really cohesive social groups. Highly cohesive subgroups often have clear norms and expectations for group members' beliefs, identities, and behaviors. Social cohesion also facilitates the monitoring, the visibility of any actions, which makes it easier to sanction someone from deviating from norms, but also reward them if they conform. So in these cohesive subgroups, this power can, these social psychological processes can be quite strong. Now, behind this sort of rationale for how sort of people adopt the behaviors that they're exposed to through their networks is this idea that individuals are going around assessing the costs and benefits of conformity or failure to conform. And while I in no way want to diminish the importance of this idea, it is sort of emphasizing the intra-individual process that is occurring within diffusion, and it also relies essentially on a rational actor, right? And so I would argue that for some of these things, for the diffusion of technology in a school, for example, that might work very well. However, it might work a lot less well for something like suicide or other sort of emotionally fraught and complex behaviors or ideas. And what it also indicates is that we're potentially like sort of leaving some important mechanisms unexplored within the network's literature, which could also like limit our ability to intervene or to facilitate interventions that might solve some of these important social problems like suicide. So this is where I argue is a very fruitful place for cultural sociology to sort of enter into social networks research. One of the interesting things about cultural sociology is that it's actually largely motivated by a similar sort of core question as what we're interested in a lot of network research, and particularly with diffusion research, and that is essentially what role does culture play in the behaviors that people engage in. Now, there's a huge literature on culture and action, and people employ a variety of sort of metaphors to sort of capture the nuances of different elements of how culture shapes action, like toolkits, schemata, cultural scripts, etc. But what I'd like to do is essentially illuminate one aspect of this literature on culture and action in order to sort of further our understanding of how diffusion may occur in some circumstances. And specifically, what I'd like to emphasize is that our decision to engage in a behavior, like in order to make that decision, we have to understand the rules governing the meaning of the behavior. Essentially the who, what, when, where, and why someone would do, fill in the blank behavior. So specifically, I'm going to draw on this concept of cultural frames, which was originally developed or introduced by Irving Goffman, although it's sort of proliferated throughout cultural sociology. And essentially, what cultural frames are is they're these like generalized meaning sets that help us help provide the why for understanding behavior. And specifically, they facilitate our ability to understand and interpret the behaviors that other individuals engage in. Now, really importantly about cultural frames is that they are external to the individual, and they're often rooted very powerfully in our meso-level social context. So basically the social groups where we live our daily lives, although they can also be at the macro level. Also, frames can be internalized into sort of these concrete behavioral repertoires that I myself might imagine engaging in order to express myself to my salient social groups. So they're learned from others, they're intersubjective, but they have the power to become very meaningful to the individual such that they shape behavior. So to Goffman's sort of original idea, I'd also like to add like a performative element, which is that our behaviors often have an intended and unintended audience that is so often embedded within the frame or within the sort of shared cultural understanding of the meaning of a certain behavior. So, I don't know how logical or not it is to realize that suicide is not just a sort of tragic outcome, but it's also actually a cultural act that is imbued with certain sort of meanings that actually vary from culture to culture or even subgroup within the United States. And I'm not alone in thinking about this. I did catch myself actually when I was looking over this talk, because I was like, oh, wow, my explanation here is actually very rooted in like American suicidology, to think of suicide as this like, way to express extreme distress, hopelessness, or anomie. It's also, somewhat Durkheimian there. But actually, like, that's not necessarily the main way that suicide would be interpreted in, say, Japan, right? And there's an interesting sort of medical anthropological literature that documents just how varied the symbolic meaning of suicide can be from society to society. Unfortunately, none of those anthropologists are doing work within the United States, or at least not that I've found. So within the United States, we do know that we have this very medicalized understanding of suicide in the United States is largely caused by mental illness. We do have some research, not a lot, that shows that. But if we think about this issue, that the cultural meaning or what suicide symbolizes, it does indeed vary. I think there's reason to consider these cultural mechanisms that might actually promote diffusion. And so very briefly, essentially my hypothesis with this work is that exposure to the suicides of significant others, broadly defined, may transform this sort of distant idea of suicide as something that a certain type of person does, say someone with a mental illness or something, foreign or far, into something that people like me could use to cope with X, Y, or Z set of circumstances. So in other words, exposure to suicide can shape the meaning of suicide. Now, before I sort of move on into sort of my case, I want to just briefly like sort of share what is known about suicide diffusion specifically. So I mentioned at the beginning very briefly that there is a fairly substantial literature that uses a variety of strategies to assess causality within survey data that does show that suicidality and perhaps suicide death can diffuse through social ties, and that this is not entirely due to social selection or homophily. And this is sort of repeatedly found regardless of the specific strategy for causal modeling that is used. Another thing that we know is that socially bounded spaces are more likely to experience a cluster than more diffuse or less bounded spaces. So places where you can sort of identify in-group members versus out-group members very clearly are more prone to experiencing a cluster. And high schools and colleges are one of the like primary places where clusters occur. We also have some research that shows that adolescents are more vulnerable to dying by suicide as a part of a cluster as opposed to a solitary suicide, and this is compared to other age groups. And then there's been some research by Madeline Gould recently that showed that places with front page, very sensationalized media coverage is more likely to, of one adolescent suicide, is then more likely to go on and have a cluster follow that initial suicide. And then one of the really like sort of frustrating things, particularly on the research on suicide clusters, which is a specific type of diffusion, is that it's really failed to identify risk factors that are unique to suicide clusters as opposed to sort of solitary suicide deaths. So we really know very little about why these things form, and more, perhaps not more importantly, but importantly also how to stop them when they begin to occur. So why it matters. I'm not going to belabor this, but suicide is a leading cause of death among adolescents. It's also a highly prevalent problem, particularly when we think about suicide ideation or suicide attempts. Also, a significant number of youth are exposed to the suicidality of their friends or the suicide death of a friend or family member. And then finally, in recent years, the media has been very quick to sort of talk about the substantial increases in the suicide rates of like middle-aged white men, particularly low-educated white men, but actually adolescents have been experiencing this really, really dramatic increase in suicide, particularly youth ages 10 to 14. I think it's like tripled. And females ages 15 to 24 are also experiencing really dramatic increases in suicide rates. And in fact, the CDC just in August released this report using the latest data showing that for girls ages 15 to 19, we're actually at a 40-year high right now. So this is really a pressing social problem that I think deserves a lot of attention. So research on suicide diffusion is sort of based on three types of studies. There's studies of mass suicide clusters, which I'm not going to touch today. They're just spikes in the suicide rate that are temporally bounded, but not geographically. Then there's suicide point clusters, which are both spikes in their suicide rate that are both temporally and geographically bounded. And there is evidence that these are actually like statistically significant clustering events. There's quite a lot of like biostatisticians who've taken on that research. And then there's research on dyadic diffusion through personal role models, which is some of my prior research where ego is exposed to the suicide attempt or death of an alter. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage qualitative data largely from an echo suicide cluster case study, which is an echo suicide cluster is essentially a point suicide cluster that occurs repeatedly over time in the same place. And then I'm going to also sort of use some qualitative data I have on dyadic diffusion in order to sort of understand the sort of unique experience of the echo suicide cluster and compared to exposure through a direct personal role model that isn't a part of a cluster. So to do this, I'm going to introduce my case, which is from Poplar Grove. So Poplar Grove, it's a pseudonym. I don't disclose the location of the community per their request, but it is a small community. It's less than 50,000 people. If there's no traffic, you can drive across it in about 7 minutes. It's suburban, it's majority white, more than 95% white. It's very affluent. It's over 90% home ownership. And not only that, there's no apartments, there's no hotels in the town. So I have to go away. If I would like to visit the community, I have to stay elsewhere. It's also, so in my past research, I've sort of really illustrated how it's a very socially cohesive community, and it's also very culturally homogeneous. They have very clear, narrow, and broadly shared beliefs about what a good kid is and what a good kid should be doing and what a good family looks like and what a good family does. There is also prevalent mental health stigma in the community, and most importantly, they do see mental illness or having a mental illness as being at odds with this vision of a good family or a good kid. So you can read my article if you'd like to hear all of the details on that, but for today, I'd like us to just sort of take that as granted. So it also is a community with a significant adolescent suicide problem that's been going on for over 10 years and actually stretches back to about 2000. This is a widely recognized problem, although it's contested more for these reasons around mental health stigma rather than the actual facts. So what the period that I really focus on in the majority of my work is sort of from 2005. So since that time, 16 current or recent graduates of Poplar Grove High School, which is a large public school that it's the only public school in the community, have died by suicide since 2005. All of these individuals have been under the age of 25, and this is significantly higher than what one would expect for a high school of this size, given national and even the state suicide rates. And actually, even if I just look at the kids who died while they were current students at Poplar Grove, it is a disproportionately high rate. It's hard to calculate a rate for, a base of 2,000, of course. So, and one of the interesting things as well is that a lot of the current students who've died are actually adolescent girls, which is also sort of surprising given the fact that in general, boys are much more likely to die by suicide than girls. So in addition, the community has experienced at least 3 suicide clusters where the decedents or the people who died by suicide had sort of confirmed ties to each other and died within a short period. Sometimes it's hard to see where one cluster ends, so there can be additional deaths. But the community basically loses 1 kid a year, 1 person under the age of 25 to suicide. Although actually in the past 2 years, knock on wood, there hasn't been a suicide death. Unfortunately, there were 3 youth suicide deaths that happened during our field work. And all of them were followed by a spike in suicide attempts, which some people would also consider a cluster. And that's as reported by community youth and mental health workers and parents in the community who were reporting about their own children. So in terms of methods, my data is largely coming from interviews with community members, focus groups. We did both interviews and focus groups and for 2 reasons. One, the focus groups helped us to kind of get a broad sense of like how the community was functioning and to talk to diverse groups. We split the focus groups up based on people's role in the community, like whether they were a mental health worker, a parent, or a kid, or a young adult. But we also wanted the ability to accommodate young respondents who sometimes felt more comfortable bringing their best friend in to do a focus group with them. So adults sometimes were put in a focus group, but kids actually always chose their own focus group. So I didn't assign people to focus groups, but they came in sort of like, here's our little cluster, we want to talk to you. A lot of people participated in both an interview and a focus group, but we just wanted to have flexibility with individuals because of the sensitive nature of the topic. And, and other people only wanted to do an interview, young people and adults, because they wanted to really talk privately. So we also did participant observation whenever possible, particularly around sort of suicide prevention events. And I've conducted a media analysis of newspapers, obituaries, and sort of other publicly available social media data. And then a family actually also offered us a 3,000 word journal of their child's last 12 days, which has also been a part of the study. So the fieldwork largely occurred from 2013 to 2016. And within Poplar Grove, our total sample size is 98. Again, we really tried to take a broad perspective, so we've talked to quite a diverse group of respondents, although obviously current students and young adults are sort of our empirical focus. We do recategorize all of these groups of individuals into the general category of mental health professional or mental health worker or parents, depending on what the main thing they were reporting on, because there's only a few pediatricians, there's only a few pastors in the community, so if we were to be more specific, it would be really revealing. Also, the school did not really want us talking to their guidance counselors and teachers, so the teachers and guidance counselors that we did speak to felt a bit nervous about it, and so this is how we handle that. We also interviewed respondents with a lot of different relationships to the person who died, including parents who lost their own child to suicide, parents whose child lost a close friend, and then individuals who lost their best friend, classmate, acquaintance, or sibling. We tried to take a diverse recruitment strategy. We had a lot of community support, particularly through these particular organizations, the Suicide Prevention Committee, this is all pseudonyms, the Mental Health Counseling Center, a bereavement center, and then several religious organizations were also very helpful. And one of these offered us office space, which was really, actually several of them did. We relied on word of mouth, that you could trust us and that it wouldn't be a terrible experience to talk to us was really important to respondents. And then we also attended community events and sat there with a table just to explain what we were doing and answer questions from community members. We did not approach anyone directly because, again, this is a sensitive topic in the community and for individuals especially who have lost someone to suicide. We did, as a courtesy, let one community leader know that we were doing the research. So in addition to this, we have a suicide bereaved young adult, and for the main purpose of this talk, I'm going to call them a reference group, although we also are doing analyses that more forefront their experience. So these are young adults ages 18 to 30. They've lost someone they care about to suicide. They have no ties to Poplar Grove, although a good portion of them live within 40 or 50 minutes of Poplar Grove. And so the purpose of this reference group is to help us understand the experience of suicide bereavement more generally, but also to help us sort of understand what was unique about Poplar Grove and experiencing this repeat suicide cluster phenomenon. So we have 19 of those individuals. Our analytic strategy was fairly standard for qualitative research. We are fans of the abductive analytic strategy, where you sort of do both grounded theory and then evaluate hypotheses from existing theory and research. And then you focus on surprising findings that are going to be the most fruitful for pushing theory and knowledge forward. So importantly, Seth and I are big believers in independent coding and then checking our coding against each other. So all of the data was independently coded, and particularly, and you'll see that sometimes we sort of categorize respondents as having a certain belief in this paper or not. And so Seth and I do that separately, and then we discuss our codings, and then any discrepancies we talk about them and we present our evidence for our coding, and then usually we come to a pretty easy conclusion. And then both as part of our agreement with the community to share our findings and to help them with suicide prevention, but then also because of our own interest in sort of fact checking what they thought about our research, we did a series of formal and informal presentations in the community to see what they thought and to help them with suicide prevention. And their consensus was that it was a bit hard to listen to our research because we don't emphasize what's great about the community, but they did feel that it was an accurate portrayal. All right, so just to briefly preview my findings, today I'm going to really focus on these two issues about beliefs about what causes suicide in the bereavement group, this sort of reference group, and then within the Poplar Grove group. I did want to just allude to the fact that, if we think about the cultural meaning of suicide, what causes suicide is only one element of the cultural meaning that could matter to diffusion processes. In the interest of not keeping you guys here for hours, I'm just going to focus on that top one. But Sonia, Seth, and I are doing some really interesting work that looks at whether people conceptualize suicide as selfish or not, and the role of exposure to other people's grief, not just your own grief, and how that the role that that plays in how you think about suicide and how vulnerable you are to it. And we did find this in sort of interesting group that we call the inoculation group, who actually felt that they were less vulnerable to suicide after they lost someone to suicide. And some of those individuals actually were suicidal before they lost their friend. And then afterwards, they were just like, no, that is too traumatic. All right, so, but that's just a brief sort of allusion to there is more that cultural sociology could offer us. But all right, so I alluded to this earlier about the generalized understanding of the causes of suicide in the United States. And as I said, mental illness, the belief that mental illness causes suicide is very prominent, and we refer to this as the mental illness frame for suicide. And in fact, in our reference group respondents, 89% presented mental illness as their dominant frame for understanding death by suicide. And in fact, individuals in this group usually had one understanding, and it was not terribly complex. It was like, well, my friend was sick, and that's why they died. And of course, this is not surprising given our medicalized understanding of suicide. So one example of this comes from Susan. She lost her brother to suicide, and she says, I completely understand that Jeremiah was sick, and not to justify his suicide, but I get the complexity of depression. From what I gather and the way that the brain works, as far as once you get to a point of deciding that you're gonna take your life. So I get it, why he did what he did. And she actually trailed off there. So one of the interesting things to also note about this is that Susan situates mental illness as something sort of biological and in the brain. And as I said already, that mental illness was very clearly seen as the primary cause, and she didn't have sort of alternate explanations for why this person did this. So Susan was not alone in this sort of situating it in the brain and biology. No one ever actually explicitly mentioned genetics, but they would mention disease, in the brain, etc. So in Poplar Grove, youth and young adults also were, this idea that mental illness produces suicide was also quite prevalent. Specifically, 88% of these youth and young adult respondents referenced the mental illness frame. So one example comes from Leah. She's a teen. She lost her close friend Stella to suicide. And so Leah shared, it takes a certain type of person to get to that point, and a certain type of depression that they're experiencing. It's not like their personality wants to suicide. It's not like the friend in them or the daughter in them or the father in them wants to suicide. It's the chemicals in their mind. And it takes a certain type of person to be pushed to the edge, a certain kind of impulsive person, or some other quality that makes them more adept to acting on a rash term. But it's not the person that you see in them. It's the disease, I think. But one of the interesting things that came out of our interviews in Poplar Grove was that they sort of also presented this frame, but with a twist. And that was in part in their understanding of what is causing the mental illness that then goes on to trigger suicide. And so at the end of every interview, we asked these youth and young adults to kind of tell us what is the most important thing for us to understand about what is causing suicide in this community. And at that point in the interview, Leah actually chose to emphasize something quite different, and that is the intense local pressure. And so here she shares, honestly, I just say the most emphasis should be put on the pressure that people feel around here. And even when I try to explain the pain of the pressure to my parents, it's hard for them to understand. It's really hard to explain. And they just don't realize that it gets kind of old. It's a lot of pressure. Kids can be really hard on themselves, especially when they've been kind of raised thinking they're not good enough. The parents do it out of love, but it's just a lot. Because even when, your parents will encourage you no matter what you do in life, when you go walking down the street or you go eat dinner at your friend's house, you're just worrying about their parents and what they think of you. It's just kind of always there. And, one thing that's interesting is actually Leah doesn't feel that her parents are really high pressure, but she still has very much internalized this, the stress that comes from pressure. I think another sort of interesting thing to recognize in this quote, and these are all things that reappear in our interviews, is that she switched from understanding Stella to understanding herself and her own experience, right? And so this is an element of the sort of causes of suicide that reappears. So for Leah then, mental illness is both rooted in this biology and in the social experience of stress. And she did also very explicitly attribute Stella's death to both of these. Not only did she say before she was talking about Stella when she talked about a certain kind of person, but she also said that Stella would As an example, Stella would wear herself ragged, trying to please everybody and trying to do all the things that she thought she had to do. So in Poplar Grove, recall that 88% reported this mental illness frame, but 81% of youth and young adults also reported feeling that pressure was really contributing to suicide in the community. Obviously, these are not mutually exclusive. We did not force people into, exclusive box. Also, this pressure frame was very much reified by adults in the community, even by mental health workers. And then, as I wrote in a separate paper, it also appeared very deliberately crafted in the newspapers and the media reporting on the early suicides in the community. Now, one of the really interesting things about this pressure frame is that it became essentially locally generalized, so that youth with less direct experience with suicide, so people who were classmates but maybe were not the best friends of the people who died, they actually adopted this pressure frame, and sometimes were less keen to focus on the mental illness frame. And so one example of that comes from Lily. She's an adolescent. She lost a classmate. And she shared, from the beginning of middle school, we start thinking about a career path. And I think that's really hard, especially for me. Again, noticing that self-reference. Personally, I feel like a lot of the kids feel like they don't know where they're going. And then they realize that there's so much pressure around them that maybe they'll never get out of the pressure or the town, or they'll never get a real job or a real life outside of their teenage nightmare. Now, one thing you might be sort of wondering is well, maybe these kids are just thinking about what they're suffering from and then attributing that to other people. And that, certainly may be happening, at least in part, but there's this other layer to it, which has to do with the conversations that were happening more broadly around the community. And the reason why the sort of mental illness frame was not sufficient for understanding suicide for community members. And that has to do with the fact that a lot of the suicide decedents, not all, but most of them, and most of the ones who were very broadly talked about, actually did not fit this image of mental illness causing suicide. They did not appear mentally ill. They did not even publicly appear emotionally distressed. On top of that, many of them appeared to be these perfect youth who were completely living up to ideals. So what that sort of generated was this sort of cultural incongruence between expectations about who should be vulnerable to suicide and then who they were actually seeing dying by suicide in the community. So one example is the case of Michelle, who died by suicide. Her classmate Shannon describes, from the outside, Michelle was just this picture-perfect girl, the sports star, and super smart, and definitely going places, and dating this really awesome guy. And her suicide, it just seemed a little bit, it was confusing. There's not really another word to use for it. And then also, this same pattern was reified by mental health workers who sometimes I wanted to say, you guys should know better. Come on. But so one example comes from Harrison, who is a mental health worker in the community who should have known better. And he shared with us, a young lady, Kennedy, who died by suicide and absolutely devastated everybody around her because she was a bright, articulate, intelligent, if you just look sort of on the outside, you'd say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And I think you can also hear a bit of mental health stigma in there, right? Because it's you could be bright, articulate, intelligent, and still have a mental illness. Those things are not at odds. So on top of that, there was actually quite explicit and acknowledged and understood pressure to not talk about mental illness as an explanation for suicide in the community. And that's, that's a complex thing, right? Because in some ways people leverage a mental illness frame to separate themselves from blame for not knowing their child or their friend was going to die. But in Poplar Grove, since good kids were not mentally ill and should not need mental health help, parents sort of actively suppressed mental illness, sort of information about mental illness in their kids. And then community members also were very, very hesitant to ever talk about the fact that one of the suicide decedents may have had a mental illness. An interesting corollary to this is that youth that died by suicide who did fit sort of prevalent stereotypes about suicide, for example, one kid was perceived to be a drug abuser and he died by suicide. And, there was a little week-long spike of people contacting me and, gossiping about it, but it wasn't this sort of enduring conversation. And it really, it was oh, okay, we can make sense of that. We can move on. Instead, the youth that don't fit these stereotypes, the morning rituals, the gossip, even the media coverage was much, much more substantial, which sort of, you know, changes the broader cultural frame for understanding suicide. And then, as I said, there's this active work to craft a narrative that preserved the identities and the reputation of the young suicide decedents. As Lily like very bluntly put it, no one trash talks the dead kid. So I also just want to point out that this scenario was actually incredibly terrifying for kids. This was super upsetting to not be able to understand why some kids were dying and other kids. And you know, they would say things like, we just don't know who's going to be next. I'm terrified every day that it's going to be one of my friends. And so one example of this sort of anxiety comes from Amelia, who again, she lost her classmate Michelle. And she said, losing Michelle, my classmate, to suicide is different from anything else I've ever experienced. All you're thinking about is like, why? Because no one just does that. They always have to have a reason for doing it. It makes you look at the people around you closer. It makes you scared to lose anyone else. You feel like everything is just falling off and you're trying to catch everything. And so, as I said, Amelia was not the only youth to report this sort of anxiety around not being able to understand suicide. And I just want to say that, you know, the school was actively not talking to these kids about suicide. And in fact, they were trying to suppress all conversation of suicide. So even when a really high profile suicide would occur, they would bring in like kind of crisis response for a little bit. They would cripple crisis response's ability to be effective within the school through rules and like not letting the crisis responders actively talk to the kids within the school. It was very strange. So there was these kids were left alone to like figure this out. All right, but getting back to this like idea of diffusion, if we think back to my main question, which is how can this research help us understand how diffusion occurs? My hypothesis was essentially that exposure to the suicide renders suicide a more salient and accessible option for youth to imagine to cope with their own sort of stress or emotional distress. And so one of the things that concerns me about this pressure frame, even though I agree these kids might be sort of astute, you know, budding sociologists who are quite aware of what is making them miserable in their community, but it does invoke this broadly shared experience of pressure that makes many youth in the community miserable, and it invokes it as a cause of suicide, essentially rendering these kids now as understanding themselves as vulnerable to suicide. So I would say my final task here today is to link this like frame that's unique to this community to vulnerability to suicide. So just briefly, I have two examples to share with you. This first comes from Becca. She had a classmate die by suicide, and she's had several of her friends attempt, and one of her best friends attempted. And so when she was asked why suicide, and she was asked, like, why are you worried about suicide constantly? And she actually switched the question. We were talking about her and her friends, but she switched it to actually be self-reflexive, which was a little bit of a surprise in the context of the conversation. And she shared, I've wanted to get away from having all of these problems. Seeing all these other people go through all these problems, their answer is suicide, so why can't my answer be suicide? Madison, who lost her friend to suicide when she was asked a similar question, and Madison was a little more forthcoming about the fact that she's struggled with suicidality in the past, she shared, Mark has had so many issues of his own, and now he doesn't have them anymore. Like, how great would that be? So it's just kind of like, what a great idea. Like, you don't have to deal with any of your problems anymore. Like, you could just be. On top of that, we found this sort of unexpected, I didn't sort of anticipate this, but we also found sort of like attitudes that I'm calling like sort of passive attitudes about suicide that I found really concerning. And so one example comes from Grace. And so she says, I think a lot of the kids were just like, oh my gosh, that's going to be us, meaning someone who dies by suicide. We're all going to stress out and lose it. And so even if your life is great, you can still just snap one day and die by suicide. We had other kids tell us that like they thought that everyone thinks about suicide all the time. And so there was this real sort of confusion about like real risk factors. And I call this sort of like passive, a very passive idea about suicide, because if this kid ever starts like feeling emotionally distressed or, you know, even suicidal, they just have this sense that suicide is just something that happens to them rather than something that they have a pathway towards like, okay, I'm feeling this way. This is who I go talk to, or these are the steps that I can actively take to control what happens to me and my mental health. So in essence, what I found was some limited evidence. I mean, of course, suicidality is rare, and so I would not expect all the kids in my sample to be reporting these things, but I did find some evidence that youth could turn this sort of perceived motive for the suicide of others into something applicable to themselves, sort of a motive that they themselves can identify with. And we did find that this was particularly true among youth who were really suffering under the local pressure and who wished that they could live up to the expectations, who they could do a better job of living up to the expectations. Yeah, there's an interesting corollary to this, which is that some kids actually ended up rejecting the culture. They viewed it as like causing suicide, but they ended up saying, you know what, screw that. That is clearly unhealthy and it could kill me. So I'm no longer going to accept your expectations, which is, I was like, well, that's cool. And they're actually doing really well in young adulthood. They really were able to change their pathway. So I want to be clear that these like sort of, you know, I think I don't like personally hearing kids saying these things, but it's not the same thing as them saying that they're going to complete suicide or even that they're, you know, clearly expressing suicide ideation. However, there is a body of research that shows that any sort of pro-suicide attitude or viewing suicide as more acceptable, it is linked with a higher risk for suicide attempts and death at a later time. So I do think these sort of attitudes are sort of probabilistically associated with later suicidality. So just to summarize, I'm gonna wrap up quickly. Actually, maybe I won't summarize. I'll just move into like, well, okay. So the important thing to take away from this is that exposure to suicide, it does shape youth's understanding, or it does appear to shape youth's understanding of what suicide is and what makes someone vulnerable to it. Suggesting that, you know, exploring the meaning of suicide after exposure and understanding diffusion processes is an important contribution. I think it's important to note that this is an individual and collective process, right? These are conversations that kids are sort of having internally, but then also with peers and with adults and through reading the media. And then, of course, the structural dimensions also matter within this community. There is a high degree of social cohesion that facilitates the formation of this, you know, broadly shared cultural frame for suicide. And then, of course, the high status the suicide deaths of very popular youth also seem to be more powerful shapers of the local culture than less high status youth. So I would just add that learning about the symbolic meanings of behaviors and how to leverage it to express ourselves self-reflexively, so to ourselves and also to our salient social groups, this may be sort of particularly important to the diffusion of culturally fraught or culturally salient behaviors like safe sex or perhaps rampage school shootings. And so I think that qualitative social network research may be particularly informative for understanding this sort of last mechanism of diffusion and doing a better job of articulating what it is to emulate someone or what it is to imitate. I do think this has some practical implications for suicide prevention. I think I'll talk about them if you'd like. There are also some limitations, but we're kind of down to 10 minutes. So I'd like to sort of talk, or I'll leave these up so you can understand. I think the biggest one was that like the high school was definitely not happy we were there. So they never allowed us to do an ethnography within the school walls, which I would have really loved to. But alas, that is how it goes. So anyways, I'd love to hear from you all and take your questions. Or if you want, I can talk about suicide prevention. It's a pet topic of mine. Elaine?
I really appreciated your talk. One of the first questions that I would have is if you think that this could apply to other institutions like the military. And the reason that I bring this up is because one of my cousins died by suicide this spring. He's in the military. And a lot of what you're saying about school systems, I think kind of applies. And then this framework, I find this framework about pressure. And I just picked out a couple of quotes, this idea of not being good enough and that you'll never get out of there. I feel like that was particularly salient for his experience because the military was his way out of a blue-collar town. And it is for so many Latinos and Hispanics who are not able to go to school or who have no other way out of their town. And so I'm just really kind of curious how you could apply or how you could think about that.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry for that loss. That's really tough. so actually Seth and I have a paper forthcoming at Sociological Theory that actually sort of like formalizes, not the diffusion part of this, because that's something I've kind of done for this group, although I'd like to kind of actually formalize that in a theoretical article. But thinking about this, the power of cultural homogeneity and high levels of integration, like that's something that Seth and I really lay out in the first paper from this project. And so we've actually formalized it. And one of the examples that we used as an area that these sorts of ideas might be really helpful is for understanding suicide in the military. And that's actually an example that we use in the paper. And, one of the sad things, like Bernice probably knows this really well, but like a lot of sociologists are not doing research on suicide. And so what it means is that a lot of the research on military suicides is happening from this very medicalized psychological framework where they're looking for diagnosable conditions, and they're not really considering the role that cultural beliefs or cultural norms or escape or they're not really looking at what that's at how that might contribute and how that might really matter to suicide prevention. I mean, that's one of my things is I actually think that some of these things have to be addressed if we're gonna deal with suicide in these specific spaces. So yeah, I think that it's going to be coming out in the first issue of Sociological Theory. It's just one example that we use to sort of drive home the point. We're really trying to get more sociologists to do this kind of research. So we're kind of like tossing ideas out there. And so, yeah, I agree, basically. I think it is a really important and fruitful direction. Yeah, and important. Mm-hmm.
So I just ordered a book called Generation on a Tightrope. And so I'm sure that at least the description talked about this idea of pressure. And when we first started You Bring Change to Mind on this campus, I was talking to somebody, a student in student government, and her comment was, well, after all, we are the most stressed generation ever. And I thought that was a really interesting comment because I didn't know whether it was like a teaching moment for me, or just to shut up and let her go on, because I'm sort of very interested in the social construction of this pressure, because how can these kids be more under pressure than people who grew up during World War II or the Great Depression? Or so do you have any sense of the essence of the nature of this pressure?
That's a really interesting question. The pressure in this community hasn't changed since the 2000. So and the narrative for pressure causing suicide emerged around the first high-profile suicide deaths. And there actually is a cluster that the entire community points to as this is the start of our problem. So that sort of undermines this, like, we are the only stressed out generation, at least based on my one case. I do think that there's something that has happened with the younger people in this that I've spoken to about the economic recession, and they have this sort of vision that part of their ideal adulthood would be to have the beautiful home in an expensive neighborhood and a lake house or some place where you go skiing, like a ski. I don't even know what I call it, but a place. These people have like other houses, in destinations that are desirable for vacations. And so that's a very big part of them. Like if they're going to reproduce their parents' socioeconomic status, like that's what they would be shooting for. A lot of their parents also have this sort of like, we worked hard and we made it. So some of their parents started sort of lower SES, some didn't, or, and then also there's also just that narrative of I'm a self-made person. But so I do think that the economic recession is sort of an interesting thing that has, been in the background of this, this period that could be increasing anxieties for youth. Another sort of interesting sort of thing about the structural location of this community is that it does have quite a few impoverished communities around it, poor white communities, and then also poor Black communities that are like really high violence. And so there is this sort of strong conception of an other, and so there's this in-group, out-group that is even, you know, more amplified than it may be in other suburban communities because of the proximity to these places that they really, really, really denigrate, both the poor white and the poor Black communities. So it's sort of an interesting question. I think that, you know, you didn't bring this up, but also this issue around social media, like, I don't entirely know how to wrap my mind around it. And, you know, one of my graduate students accused me of like not doing a good enough job of understanding social media. And so as I'm, you know, preparing to write the book from this, we're like reanalyzing. And it is true that a lot of these kids don't have any downtime, don't have any time away from the sociocultural world that they're in. They also do find out about suicides through social media, through text. So, you know, I think, you know, I don't know, like I do have a hunch that social media could be contributing to this increase in suicide that we're seeing. But, you know, again, it's sort of a topic we need more research on, and we need, you know, a better understanding of how it's mattering. But you know, that could contribute to this pressure, especially as kids are vulnerable to social comparison, but they're also seeing these very, you know, curated views of how the other people's lives are going. So. Hank, did you have your hand up? Oh, I'm sorry.
What we were talking about the pressure frame, and I want to ask a question sort of about the mental health frame, and it might not be quite relevant because these children are young.
Mm-hmm.
But are they telling this narrative about sort of chronic mental health kind of things or acute mental health?
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I would say that in the reference group, it's more chronic. It's more understood as like this person is sick, as like a permanent trait that they can't escape. Within Poplar Grove, some of the parents will talk about their kids in that similar way. And you know, there's even some support. I mean, some of these kids that died, like when you get into the sort of private information that's surrounding their death, there were some pretty serious mental health problems that were happening for a lot of these kids. So some of those parents do strongly believe that there was this sort of trait, you know, unchanging, very serious mental illness problem. It's hard to know, right? Although some of them, like one of the more recent ones, also very much believes in you know, the power of therapy, and that's kind of one of the sad things. But they're, but the youth in Poplar Grove view it more as like the social cause, and so that is then more sort of, it could happen to anyone, it could come and go. But then, you know, what concerns me is that coping with it is not at all sort of a part of the conversation. You know, I mean, there was one time I asked them about coping with it, like, what do they do to cope? And they were like, oh, we go running. I was like, I mean, that can be healthy, except for that athletics are so important to this community that engaging in exercise actually just buys into like one of the other sort of pressures that they very acutely feel. So, in the back.
How was medication viewed? Were any of your participants like really pro medication, really anti?
So they didn't want people to find out that they were on medication, and they felt that it would become very obvious if they went and became medicated. They felt like it would become, everyone would know it, and that was something that embarrassed them or concerned them. So medication was mostly talked about in that framework of like, I don't want people to know that I'm medicated. There were some parents who believed that medication caused suicide, but in the corner, and then I'll go to Tim.
I guess I have two questions. Was there any evidence of like a diffusion of the type of suicide, right? So
Yes.
The actual specifics.
Yeah.
And
There is.
Was there different reconceptualizations of suicide in the wake of an actual death versus an attempt? Is it right? Did they actually view attempts differently than actual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can tell you what I know from my data. So like first is like, yes, all of these kids are using basically 3 highly lethal means to attempt or die by suicide. and they're highly lethal, so they are dying. I mean, it's hanging, jumping, and firearms, with hanging being probably the most prevalent. So in terms of so suicide attempts are in this community between friends kind of a good way to actually get resources. If you want your friends to understand that you're suffering, and they are suffering when they do it, they're not joking, but I do have some limited sort of evidence that that it can be a way to make your friends understand, I am really hurting right now. Yes. No. I would say that more that's what a suicide attempt can mean within a friendship. But I will say I have only a very few cases that where they went into that kind of detail around suicide attempts. So Tim, I mean, it looks like we're kind of at 4, but if do you want to, and I'll stay here.
In the same way that people use suicide with the pressure frame, a mental illness frame, people also use different techniques with meaning. So I'm wondering, I mean, you said that hanging is most prevalent. I'm interested in the way in which these different configurations of meaning play around with different sort of types. So if there's an expression of a pressure frame, does that manifest itself? Does that attach itself to a meaning with hanging more than it does with gun violence? Or if there's any sort of way to interesting configurations of meaning along both the type and suicide generally?
That's really interesting. I'm not sure that I really know the answer to that. I mean, so some of the suicides are public, and some of them, they happen in a park, and then people see it. And I don't know that I can really, I don't think I can really answer that. I don't think that I've seen variation really in how people make sense based on the method. There's certainly, it gets a little bit more complex. So there's one person who used a highly lethal means and survived, and she's seen as a faker in this really nasty way, because then what happened was a girl did the same thing and died, and that just really upset everybody. So there's some blame that goes back to her, but I'm not sure there's been a lot of variation in terms of how people make sense of the suicide. It really has more to do with if they seemed like they fit a stereotype about suicide, like they were a drug user or they were some sort of screw up, that triggered one sort of set of meaning making, whereas if they were these popular perfect kids, that it triggered something else, and not really difference based on the type of method that was used.
Sorry, I know we're at the end.
I mean, I'll keep answering questions. I just want to, if anyone has to leave, it's after 4 and I won't be offended.
Given the stigma that you observed in the community around mental illness, how did they deal with that? How have they dealt with this as a community in dealing with the rates of suicide? How has the school dealt with it? Sounds like not at all. But,
Yeah, I mean, the school does not want to talk about it. They really just try to suppress everything. Oh, and then they're also it's not our fault. It's not our fault. It's not our fault. Don't blame us.
it's shocking to me that parents let them get away with that.
Yeah, I mean,
To not providing services with the kids, because that's the one logical place to provide services.
yeah, but this is a wealthy community, so they have a lot of guidance counselors. So, I mean, actually, that's one thing the community says is we need more services. And I gave a talk there after one of the deaths. I flew out and just to do this answer session to kind of try to help parents deal with their kids that were now suffering. And they brought in a clinical psychologist as well. And she's like, yeah, I'm going to stop you right there. You guys are really wealthy and you have more access to everything than most other communities. And so that can't be what's wrong with your community. But they do a lot of that. They also try really hard to not admit that there's a suicide problem. So, I mean, it was really the mental health workers that brought me in and that made sure I had support, to get the research done. So anybody who sort of did not have a sort of, the school has a reputation to maintain, but people who did not have a reputation to maintain, And I mean, there's some people who have lived in the community, they work in the community essentially as mental health workers. They're so enraged by all of this that they have stopped all their friendships within the community. And so those people were very willing to help me in like a different way. But, you know, there's a very high cost to like this sort of thing that is happening. And then, you know, some parents, they just think it's normal, that they just think kids die by suicide and they don't realize that there is a problem in the community. Even though they're like, yeah, I mean, this is one family that lost their kid. They were talking with me and they were just like, you know, we just thought that was normal. We just thought this was the normal rate of suicide. Nobody ever told us differently. The public health department puts out stats that like basically say there's no suicide problem here. And the thing is that it's this one high school. So if you look at, you know, broader geographic areas, which is how the public health department does it, you don't see it. So that's actually a little sort of bone I have to pick with how we do suicide, you know, rates calculations is that, look, kids' lives center around the school. So where you're going to find a suicide problem is with the school as the denominator. But that's not how we think about it. I get it. You know, I'm enough of a demographer that I know that's like, you know, it's hard to calculate a suicide rate with a base of like 1,000, 2,000. But you can still realize that if there have been 4 girls that have died by suicide who are current students in 10 years, that is a very abnormally high suicide rate. You know, you'd expect less than 1 girl every 10 years to die by suicide in the school. So.
So not a question, but thank you for today.
Thanks, Dan.
To a reception, and Anna will be for a bit if you want to chat.
Yeah, I will be around. So.